To understand why Canada never evolved its own full-fledged car brand, at least in the modern sense, we need to rewind time to the birth of the Canadian auto industry, its golden age, the turning points, and how trade policy and global economics reshaped everything. The first large-scale automobile production in Canada began in 1904. In Walkerville, now Windsor, Ontario, when Walkerville Wagon Works made 117 Ford Model C vehicles. Actually, Canada was once among the top producers in the world. By the 1920s, Canada ranked second globally in auto production. One of Canada's first owned automakers was the Russell Motor Car Company, Toronto, 1904 to 1915. It even marketed itself as thoroughly Canadian, built with Canadian labor, materials, and capital. But despite these early pioneers, the longer-term pattern favored foreign ownership. Over time, plants in Canada were largely subsidiaries or factories of American and later Japanese automakers. A critical moment came in 1965, when Canada and the United States signed the Automotive Products Trade Agreement, widely known as the Auto Pact. The deal had two major provisions. First, a 1-to-1 ratio of production to sales between Canada and the U.S. Second, requirements on Canadian value-added content. In practice, this treaty made Canada an assembly hub. Foreign companies could build in Canada, benefit from favorable tariff-free access to the U.S., and tap into Canada's skilled workforce without necessarily building a homegrown brand. In the decades following the Auto Pact, Canada became deeply integrated into the North American automotive ecosystem. Today, Canada is still primarily an assembly and parts nation, not a designer of its own full car marque. The major automotive players in Canada include Stellantis, Ford, GM, Honda, and Toyota. These companies run assembly plants in Ontario and elsewhere. There's also a network of almost 700 auto parts suppliers in Canada, including homegrown companies like Magna and Linamore. Regions like the Great Lakes, Ontario area became a manufacturing cluster, positioning Canada as a critical part of the North American auto supply chain. For foreign automakers, building in Canada was cost-effective, cheaper labor in some respects than the U.S. Good infrastructure. From Canada's perspective, attracting foreign car makers meant high-value jobs, technology transfer, and industrial growth without assuming the risk of launching and sustaining an independent auto brand. Over time, Canada specialized in what it was good at, not full car design and global brand competition, but assembly, parts production, and Tier 1 half-supplier networks. There was also a scale problem. The domestic market in Canada is relatively modest compared to major auto-producing nations. As one analysis puts it, Canadian strategy prioritized sectors where it has competitive advantages, natural resources, technology, R&D, not trying to replicate what giants like Ford, GM, Toyota already do. Now, let's examine how early Canadian automakers faded or failed, and why they never scaled into sustainable, internationally recognized brands. Also, Motor Car Company, despite early success and ambition, struggled. By 1916, it sold its automobile business to the American firm Willys Overland. Later, there were other attempts, some small, experimental, but they never reached the scale or brand power of major global automakers. One attempt, often cited, is Bricklin, a sporty Canadian car company in the 1970s, 80s. It is frequently remembered, but it failed due to high costs, limited scale, and insufficient backing. Not in our core sources above, but commonly referenced in debates. In the Grant narrative, while Canada had assembly, it never developed the full stack design, R&D, marketing, global brand expansion needed to sustain a national automaker. The Auto Pact, while offering opportunities, also discouraged independent national brands. Foreign automakers could use Canada as a low-risk part of their manufacturing footprint. But there was no policy push for a truly Canadian-owned automaker. Investment in R&D for full vehicle creation was comparatively weak. According to some analysts, Canada's innovation in the auto sector leaned toward auto systems, parts, and supporting tech, not launching world-class automaker brands. The global auto market is intensely competitive, capital-intensive, and risky. Even in large markets, many automakers go bankrupt. For Canada to build a global-scale automaker would require massive capital, brand building, and sustained consumer sales. Canada's close economic integration with the U.S. made its plants more oriented to serve U.S. demand than to build Canadian-branded cars. Foreign automakers, especially American and Japanese, saw Canada as a location to build cars for the North American market. They retained ownership of design, engineering, and brand, while outsourcing some labor and production to Canadian plants. Over time, this structure became entrenched. Rather than trying to break out into its own car brand, Canada doubled down on being an assembly powerhouse. This arrangement, assembly-centric, foreign-owned, has had real consequences. While Canada benefits from auto assembly, the highest margin activities, design, R&D, global marketing, largely happen elsewhere, meaning less value captured domestically. Jobs in assembly are often high-paying, but profit flows to global HQs. The ownership structure limits Canada's ability to derive long-term wealth from the full value chain. Dependency risk. Because most production is foreign-owned, Canada remains highly exposed to global auto companies' decisions. If a company shifts production, Canada might lose those plants or capacity. There is a national identity gap. Many Canadians feel uneasy that there is no Canadian car, even though the plants exist. In recent years, tensions have flared. For example, in 2025, Canada launched formal dispute settlement proceedings against Stellantis, citing its decision to move Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario, to the U.S. Canada also reduced tariff-free import quotas for GM and Stellantis, criticizing their scale-back of Canadian production. These moves show how precarious the current production model can be. Politically, especially when national economic interests and global corporations collide. On social media and in Canadian public discourse, many call for a real Canadian car company. Reddit threads frequently debate whether Canada should build a crown corporation car maker or nationalize existing plants. Others argue that the domestic market is too small, or that heavy subsidies would be required, making it impractical. Still, the lack of a homegrown brand is sometimes framed as a loss of national pride or industrial sovereignty. Over the years, there have been various proposals and partial efforts, but none have resulted in a sustainable Canadian automaker. Some have suggested creating a crown corporation, i.e., a government-owned company dedicated to making Canadian cars. This would involve repurposing existing plants or building new ones. Others propose heavy protectionism, for example, high tariffs on imported vehicles to support a nascent domestic brand. But this runs counter to trade agreements and risks economic inefficiency. Technologically, Canada has the talent, strong engineering schools, R&D capacity, and supplier networks. But translating that into a consumer car company requires more than just capability. It needs capital, demand, and brand. On the electric vehicle EV front, there's been some more hopeful momentum. In 2024, Honda announced a $15 billion investment to build EV and battery plants in Ontario, its largest EV investment in Canada. This could mark a shift. Instead of assembling ICE internal combustion vehicles, Canada might become a hub for EV manufacturing. But so far, these are assembly and battery plants, still not a Canadian headquartered brand. Meanwhile, policies like Canada's auto emission framework regulating import quotas are being used to try to encourage local production, but they don't necessarily create a national automaker. Thus, even in the EV future, Canada's role may remain as a production base, not a brand innovator. Now, let's connect this history to contemporary dynamics and draw parallels that might be surprising or alarming. The 2025 dispute between Canada and Stellantis underscores how fragile Canada's automotive foundation is. Production decisions are driven by global corporations, not national strategy. The fact that Canada responded with tariff-free import quota cuts reveals a reactive posture trying to pressure foreign automakers to stay committed to Canadian plants. This dynamic raises the question, why does Canada have more leverage? Because it does own its own brands. Its industrial fate is less under its control. As companies like Honda heavily invest in EVs in Canada, there is hope for a new dawn. But unless Canada builds its own EV brand, it risks repeating the same pattern. Assembly base, not brand owner. If Canada remains a production outpost, future EV profits, intellectual property, brand value may again flow to foreign HQs. This is not just an economic challenge, but a sovereignty challenge. In a critical next-generation industry, Canada may be building other people's cars, not its own. The Canadian case shows a persistent pattern: strong manufacturing, but a weak national brand identity. It's a real-world example of how trade agreements, foreign investment, in capital-intensive industries can shape a nation's industrial destiny, not always in line with national pride or sovereignty. Economic strategy does not equal national brand. Canada's automotive strategy was never about creating a globally competitive Canadian headquartered car company. It was about leveraging its resources, skilled workforce, and favorable trade position to be a manufacturing hub that has delivered jobs and value, but not brand ownership. By integrating deeply into the North American auto system, Canada gained assembly plants but ceded control. When key companies decide to relocate production, Canada has limited bargaining power because it doesn't own the core asset, the brand. Even with massive EV investment coming in, Canada must choose: will it simply become the assembly line for other people's future cars? Or will it invest in a truly Canadian auto brand built around innovation, IP, and global identity? Like and subscribe to support more deep dives like this. Share it with friends, especially those interested in Canadian economics, trade policy, or industrial strategy.